Good morning. Delighted to be here. So I have worked, a little lower, I have worked in the area of restructuring or turning around troubled companies now for just about 20 years. And a lot of people say, gee, what do you do? What's the first thing you do when you get in? And so what I want to do for, maybe 35 or 40 minutes is just give you an example of what one situation was like, so you get some insight into, well, what does it take when a company gets on the skids? How do you get it turned around? How do you get the boat headed back in the right direction? And then we're going to have, I hope, 15 or 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So there are really kind of three stages to a successful turnaround. I'm pretty much involved in the first two. First, when you go in, you need to stabilize the company, because if you run out of money, you're pretty much out of business. When you're out of cash and out of credit, you're out of business. And so it's essential that we manage the business for cash and that we manage it in a way that we don't run out of money. Second, then, is to turn the attention to what's broken, what's wrong here, why is the company in trouble, and what's wrong, and how can I fix it? And so I need to have some initiatives that fix the operation of the business, because it's really the operation that got the business in trouble. Companies that have too much debt didn't start with too much debt in most cases, but they incurred additional debt as they didn't perform well, and then eventually they get to where they've got more debt than they can repay. But I need to think about the entire business. I need to think about the organization, the finances, the operations, the sales, the customers, the vendors, because you need to keep all of those people continuing to support the company. And then lastly, if you're able to get the ship righted, then the company can return to growth. And probably the best example of that is the General Motors Corporation, which I worked with and took through a 39-day bankruptcy. And today, we right-sized the company. When we went into bankruptcy, we knew what needed to be done, what plants needed to close, what dealers we needed to eliminate, and how many workers we needed fewer than we had. But today, the General Motors is beautifully sized for the market, and it has been generating extensive profitability ever since coming out. General Motors has returned to growth. Common elements of many companies that find themselves in trouble. In most cases, we're dealing with industries that are themselves not doing particularly well. So the revenue is weak. When there's too much capacity in a marketplace, whether it's for steel or for cars or for any product that people buy, if there's too much of it, then prices go down, margins compress, and that puts additional stress on companies. It's interesting that in most troubled companies, they have inadequate information systems. So it's very, very difficult to get really, really good information. When I went I had the opportunity to work some with Kmart, in the Kmart restructuring. I also had the opportunity to work with Walmart when I did the Handelman Company. And the Walmart systems and the support that Walmart is able to give was huge in comparison to Kmart, which had antiquated systems that really didn't talk to one another. It was very difficult to get good information at Kmart. At Walmart, it was not difficult at all. And in these troubled situations, companies find themselves with a bad balance sheet. They have too much debt. in order to support themselves. And generally speaking, it's a lousy industry. It may not be lousy forever. When General Motors failed and went into bankruptcy, the car market was horrible. The car market in North America was 9.5 million units. A couple of years before that, it had been 16 million units. The market was horrible. Nobody could buy cars. That's not true today. So in that case, it was very temporary. And there's one that I don't list, and that is, in many, if most turnarounds, there's very weak management. It's not true in 100% of the cases, but it's true in a significant majority, where the management is either doesn't see what needs to be done, or they see what needs to be done and they're unable to do it. They're unable to pull the trigger because it is some tough medicine. So I want to talk some about a company called Champion Enterprises, which is went through a restructuring with me, had a great outcome, and then the management that the board hired after we left 3 or 4 years later tanked the company again, which was very, very unfortunate. So Champion, the common elements I talked about, well, what do you have in most of these things? Margin compression. Champion Enterprises made manufactured housing. Some people call them trailers, but it was, they were homes manufactured in a factory, sent to a dealer lot and then installed on a home. But the competitive pressure was intense. The industry had been in a severe depression for several years, and the size of the market had contracted dramatically. Because of that, Champion had too much debt. The sales that it had were inadequate to pay the debt. We did have cash, which was a good thing, but it never would have been able to generate the cash that was required to repay its debt. Interestingly, it had inadequate information systems. The company itself had been formed by a series of mergers over the years, and while it was about $1 billion company, it had been put together from a whole bunch of individual acquisitions, and they had never put all of those acquisitions into a single accounting system. So I had 28 plants that were operating. I needed to go to 28 plants to get information. We couldn't get just from one single source. Terrible industry dynamics, and the weak management was also an issue. I had a lot of C&D players, and the CEO himself was really, really very stubborn, and he fought with his board, and eventually the board concluded, you know, he keeps telling us we're stupid. Actually, we think he's got that wrong, and so they decided they would make a change. The manufactured housing industry at the time had been in a real depression for several years. Shipments were down, so business was 2/3 of what it had been. Unfortunately, the business was bad. A lot of people thought it was only temporary. It's actually turned out to be a lot more permanent than temporary, and there were a number of reasons for that. Not the least of which is the cheap money that is available for site-built homes as compared to manufactured homes, which carry a much higher interest rate. And so in a lot of ways, the industry had a self-inflicted wound because in earlier years, they had feasted on easy money from Wall Street. But unfortunately, the default rates on bonds that were issued were astronomical, and so Wall Street backed away and wouldn't provide any additional financing. And if there's no financing, people really can't buy homes, and that's what happened to the market, so it dropped by 2/3. The company itself was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. We had revenues at the time of $1 billion. And the company had gone through multiple restructuring efforts trying to downsize as the industry worsened. But the actions that were taken were never aggressive enough. It was, you know, kind of chip a little bit here and chip a little bit there, and it was all done with the hope that, well, we've got this temporary downturn. And what was happening were sales were dropping like that, and costs were dropping much, much too slow. And as I mentioned, it was an unintegrated industry roll-up, which meant we had a whole bunch of different systems that we needed to get information from, which made it a challenge to do certain of the things. And when we were hired, and this was, you know, basically 10 years ago, the company was in the business of manufacturing these homes. It also sold through dealers, but it had some of its own retail locations. And lastly, it was in the lending business. It was going to finance the homes that people bought with the idea that it would finance a bunch of homes and then take those mortgages that people gave, take them to Wall Street, and Wall Street would sell bonds, securitized bonds around them. You all know what happened in the housing crisis with all of the bonds and how they failed. Well, that had happened a few years earlier in the manufactured housing industry. But Wall Street, for some reason, keeps repeating its mistakes. And I guess it's, you know, it's all about making money. But there was no way that Wall Street would touch any mortgages. So when the situation when we were hired, the company had 5 straight quarters of losses. They really had no prospect of improvement. The board terminated the former CEO on June 30th. I started on July 1st. When I came in, I had a chief operating officer, and within a couple of days I realized, you know, I can't manage around this guy. So I eliminated that position, but kept really, for the most part, kept the rest of the management team in place. There were some changes, but certainly not at the outset. And then part of the deal was when you come in, I had money, so I knew we weren't going to run out of money quickly because the company had just raised a bunch of money in a high-yield bond offering. But you needed to basically figure out, well, okay, what do I have to do to stop these quarterly losses? And so when I was hired by the board, I said, okay, at the current market level, we're going to try to figure out what it's going to take for this company to do no worse than break even. And the board said, that would be great. If you can do that, that is your objective. So, I mean, I'm one guy. And so I brought in, as part of that, some of my colleagues to do what we call a quick strike review, which is to bring in a lot of heavy hitters to study every aspect of the business and then come back and say, okay, based on our study, here are the changes that we need to make in order to break even. And that quick strike took 5 weeks. Communication is always the starting point. So, you know, this was the day that I walked into the company on July 1st. You know, the very first thing I did was to meet with the senior management team. We met with them at 8 o'clock. At 10 o'clock, we had a conference call. At the time, there were, I believe, 35 operating plants across the country. And at 10 o'clock, so that we could get the West Coast and the East Coast both at the same time, we had a telephone conference call with all of the manufacturing plants as well as the sales, all of our sales lots, to explain to them, here's what's happened, and so that, you know, you're hearing it from us and not reading it in the newspaper. We also brought in a communications company and created a DVD that day, which we FedExed out to all of the plants and all of the sales locations. And it was basically, hey, get to know Al. So, you know, they would see me, you know, in person, talk about my background, where I went to college, where I'd worked, my family, at the time, you know, the name of my cat. So it was all, you know, really just, hey, I'm just sort of a regular guy, put on my pants one leg at a time. How long is this going to last? Don't know. You know, it's going to be a while. We've got to figure, you know, we got some tough things to figure out. We'll keep you informed. There are going to have to be some changes. We can't continue the way we are, but you know, we'll give you lots of heads up about that. And thereafter, had weekly staff meetings with the senior people. I stayed in touch. Happily, I had one director who had a pretty difficult board to deal with, but I had one director who was the lead, so-called lead director, and he said, "You keep me informed, I'll take care of the board." And that was huge, because otherwise sometimes you can spend an awful lot of time trying to keep your board of directors happy, or at least informed. And then within 45 days, we had a meeting of all the entire management team, and that would have included all of the general managers of the manufacturing plants, the regional organization, the chief financial, the controllers from each of the manufacturing plants. So, you know, we probably had 150 people that we got together. So this communication, which is really important from the start, people are uneasy, they're always nervous about change, and so you need to go through change. And if you explain to people, if you're honest with people, they'll respond pretty well. If you try to hide the ball and not tell people what's going on, then that you'll get a bad reaction. At least that's been my experience. People, while it may be a tough message, they'll say, "Hey, look, you know, we're grown up. Tell us the way it is. We can deal with it. Just don't BS us." So the quick strike assessment came back, and this was done by my colleagues. They came back and said, "Okay, here's what we need to do. We need to close 4 plants. We're going to operate 30, and we're going to keep 9 idle for the time being for when the market comes back. But what we're going to do is basically close plants that are costing us money. We need to get out of 35 retail centers, and we will continue to operate 80 retail locations. And those 35 centers, we're losing money. We need to get out of trying to finance manufactured housing. We were making loans. They were good loans. They had an attractive interest rate. But we would lend $10,000, and the most that we could sell them for was $9,500. That was on a good day. So we lost $500 on every one. We were going to run out of money. So we said, we're going to shut down Home Pride Finance, sell the mortgages that we have, and use the money to do the restructuring. We knew we were going to take, from an accounting perspective, we were going to take large restructuring charges, but they would ultimately have no cash impact because the restructuring charges, and it was going to cost money to restructure. We had to lay people off, and we were going to lose money on some of the assets that we sold. So we were going to need cash for this, but we were going to, as we closed the retail locations, closed those 35 retail locations, we had 5 or 6 homes on each one of those locations. We didn't have any liens against that inventory. So as we liquidated the inventory from the 35 locations, we were able to use the cash to fund the restructuring cost. And then we had to reduce our head count by roughly 20%. And that, you know, we came back with that in 4 or 5 weeks, and basically said to the board, if we do this, we will get ourselves to a position where we can break even. So that was the plan. The objective of closing the plants would be to create value by, as much as possible, moving customers to other plants. They did not produce a common manufactured home. So in order to move customers, we had to move some of the floor plans from other plants, because you may recall I said these were all independent companies that were rolled up, so they didn't have one common product offering. But we needed to increase the plant utilization to where we would be profitable. That is, a plant has a theoretical capacity, and you can't run them at 50% and expect to make money. You need to get 70, 75, 80% utilization. We wanted to minimize our shutdown costs, obviously maximize the asset recovery, and then not disrupt our operations. In order to manage that project, it was important that it be done on time, on budget, and there were going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of tasks that needed to be done. So we had to manage the budget, we had to manage the work plan, and I had one of my colleagues from AlixPartners that was brought in who did an absolutely phenomenal job of doing that. We also had to put in place some incentives to get people to do what we wanted them to do. And so if we wanted people to sell inventory of closed lots, we offered a special sales incentive for salespeople to do what we wanted. We also offered special compensation, commission incentives for moving customers to other plants. And then we had to build a scorecard to report on all of it. I mean, there was an awful lot to be done. So I'm just going to quickly flip through. These are some of the things that my colleague prepared. And, not only did he, kind of put in a matrix, but he used red, yellow, green so that at a glance you could tell, do I have a problem? Don't I have a problem? All of the people at Champion knew that at every Monday morning I was going to get these reports. Nobody wanted to be in the red category. And so it proved to be a particularly good incentive for people to stay on track and do what they needed to be done. And these are just some of the other examples that David prepared. They were also very, very helpful with the board to go through because we had to report very accurately and actively with them. And as David said, it's all in the details. There were probably 150 pages of detailed tasks. Who was responsible? What was the task? When was it due? And he managed that. We managed that every day, all day. And if people weren't going to stay on task, we didn't say, oh, okay. What we said was, we need to stay on the budget. We need to stay on the schedule. What can we do to help you make sure that you stay on schedule? So we made people think about, don't call up and ask for an extra 2 weeks. Call up and tell them what you need in order to get it done when you're supposed to have it done. That proved to be actually very, very effective. So we were able to get these plants, get this restructuring done within about 90 days. And it's a lot to do in 90 days, but it was pretty much done within 90 days. We then had to turn our attention to the annual priorities to the plan because things weren't going to automatically get better. We needed to make some changes to improve the operating performance as well. So we said, okay, we need to improve our market share. We were the largest. I think we had about a 22% market share. We want to improve our market share from what it is to a better percentage because if the market doesn't get bigger, we want to make sure that we don't lose sales. Secondly, we wanted to reduce the amount of purchased material costs that we used. I'm going to say that about 80% of the cost of a home, of a manufactured house, was purchased material. Things like windows, shingles, paint, wood, steel, tires, all of those things. We needed to reduce that cost, and we felt we had the opportunity to do that by running a particular process that is designed to do that. We also wanted to improve the curb appeal because manufactured homes are a box, and they need to look a little bit less like a box from the curb. We actually had an architect on staff, and the guy was really, really good, but the plants didn't use him, which I couldn't get my head around. So I told the plants, you have to use Roberto if you're issuing a new home, and Roberto's going to help you. If you don't want to do what he suggests, we can talk about it, but you have to at least ask him. And so we were able to get people, and I will tell you reluctantly at first, but some of restructuring is, I mean, you ask people in a nice way, and then you tell them this is the way it is. So one way or another, you get done what needs to get done. We also went to work on improving the information technology infrastructure, made some progress on that, but not as much as I had hoped we would make. And we wanted to reduce our warranty cost and improve customer satisfaction. These homes are installed by dealers, and there was a real tendency if a home was installed and the customer wasn't happy, they would say, you know, they would have a warranty claim against the company, and the company would say it was the dealer's fault, he didn't put it in right. And so you know, you'd have that, different people pointing at each other, and the customer's unhappy, and so we had to go to work on trying to improve that. It made some progress, but not huge. And then because business improved, I was able to exchange some debt for equity. And so what we were able to do was effectively reduce about half of the debt, the bond debt that the company had, and instead issued common stock. So effectively, we put default in the rearview mirror by reducing the amount of bond indebtedness that the company had. We went to work on the supply chain, which was probably the biggest area of savings that we had. And you know, how do you reduce material cost? As I said, you know, 75 or 80% of the cost of a home was in raw material. So we formed purchasing teams, brought purchasing people from each of the different plants were involved in at least one team. And then I had one of our consultants from AlixPartners who facilitated each of those teams. And the facilitators were people who have done this process 100 times and really know how to go through a very detailed process that will result in significant reductions. And we were able to identify about $25 million of annual savings. And by the time I left at the end of June, about half of those had been implemented. So by saying that, what that meant was we had entered into contracts to reduce on an annual basis, and the company had already put into its purchasing system roughly about half of those. In getting each of the plants together to talk about this purchasing initiative and why they needed to cooperate, I had each of the plants are located, the manufacturing plants are identified on this chart. And I got together with the regional management and with the plant general managers and said, hey guys, we need all of you. If we're entering into a national contract, it's not optional whether you do it. And Champion had always been optional. You know, the general managers would decide whether it was something they wanted to do. And it's like, well, maybe you got a better price on paint, but I really don't want to use that kind of paint. I'd really rather use Sherwin-Williams paint. So we had to convince them in two ways. One, try to persuade them, and then secondly, say, hey guys, this is not optional. You will do this because the future of the company depends on it. But what it showed each of the plant managers is each one of you in this room is going to benefit from this. And the bar says how much the benefit was. And as you would expect, the one on the left, oh, this is great, excuse me. The one on the left was the biggest plant, and the one on the right was really the smallest plant. But everybody was going to benefit. So in terms of the second quarter of 2004, and then that was, you know, I'd been there just about 9 months. The company's operating results were better by $25 million. We had net income for the first time in more than a year. And manufacturing and retail were both profitable. And the market share had increased from 16% to 16% from 14%. I was wrong earlier. So we were hitting basically all of the objectives. And this is a chart of the Champion stock price. And when we started work, it was at roughly $3, $2 and change. And when I left, it was just over $9. So it shows that none of these were remarkable actions. It was just a whole bunch of actions that needed to be taken and needed to be taken very, very quickly. So at that juncture, I left and a permanent chief CEO was hired. And so for the next 3 years, from 2005 to 2007, the company continued. They were solidly profitable. Part of it was the new guy did some acquisitions. He acquired a company in the UK. And then in 2007, it all began to unravel. He had levered the company back up and borrowed a lot of money. The company in the UK that he bought went from having banner years to having like no business at all. And the industry itself never improved. So it didn't get a whole lot worse, but it did get worse. And so the company had nearly gotten out of all of its retail operations. And while the liquidity was strong and the stock price got up, things in 2007, began to unravel. And then by 2009, it was really an unhappy ending. They had a huge operating loss, and after interest, it was a $50 million loss. And the company, because they had relevered and had borrowed a lot of money for acquisitions that didn't pan out, they ended up filing bankruptcy, and the ownership was transitioned to its lenders. The company does continue today, and it's marginally profitable, and the lenders are not hugely unhappy with where they are, although I think they'd like to get out. And I guess the real lesson to the board probably should have been, when you're in a bad industry, to go out and borrow money to do a lot of acquisitions is really maybe not such a great idea, because if those acquisitions don't work out and the market doesn't improve, then you're going to be in a world of hurt. So as it turns out, the shareholders saw this recovery to $11 or $12 a share. They ultimately ended up getting nothing when the company filed 3 or 4 years later. And I think really in the interest of time, the Oxford Health Plans is another example, but I think in the interest of time, I'd like to just stop and, we can talk about whatever you want to talk about, questions or whatever. Somebody's got to break the ice. I'm going to wait you out. Yeah?
All right. So you've seen several companies that have gotten themselves kind of in deep water there. Have you found anything that, like, if there was one thing that you would say to somebody starting a new business, don't do this so you don't get in trouble, what would that be?
Oh, boy. I guess I would say don't go into a bad business. Okay. If you go into a business that has reasonable growth prospects, you'll end up doing a lot better. A rising tide floats all boats, and when a market is shrinking or declining, margins are impaired, and it's tough to chase a revenue line south. I guess that would be probably number one. Yeah. I don't know if you could hear. How much of a role did I play in GM's restructuring? Well, pretty significant. I was the chief restructuring officer, so I was there for 7 months before we went through that quick bankruptcy filing, and then for a couple of years to wind down old GM. The real issue at GM was in like November 2008. It was clear the company was going to run out of money, and the CEOs of Ford, Chrysler, GM, and the United Auto Workers went to Congress and asked for basically a bailout. And they were unprepared for questions like, how are you going to pay us back? Which seemed like that's pretty unusual that you wouldn't be able to say, well, how am I going to pay this loan back? And so the initial task was GM had to prepare a viability plan and show Congress why it was viable. So we were working on really two work streams. One was working with GM on the viability plan, and the second was preparing a contingency in case bankruptcy would be required. Companies don't like to do that, but nevertheless, getting ready if you have to file is a pretty big deal. But I was very involved, and my colleagues were very involved in defining the footprint of what the company would look like. We had some real debate with them over where the break-even point should be. They started at 12 or 12.5 million units. I wanted like 9 or 10, 9.5 million units, which is ultimately where it ended up. But that's really because that's what the government insisted on. Because we were, kind of going back and forth. They didn't want to take the pain that 9.5, would have required. But that's working with a team of probably at the time 100 consultants around the world, and the GM management. So I was in it up to my eyeballs. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, how do you get people on board when you go in? How do you overcome the resistance? And I mean, here's my experience, that if you go in and communicate with people and you're pretty honest with people, it doesn't take all that long to overcome the resistance. Now, when you come in, initially, people go out and they Google AlixPartners and they go, oh my God, they're the bankruptcy guys. So it's like, oh my God, we're going to file bankruptcy, which may or may not be the case. But very often, usually, it's not a foregone conclusion when you go in. And so it takes there's some real apprehension when you go in. But people learn pretty quickly that you're not giving them a line, you're not BSing them. You're telling them, hey, look, here's what we got to do. Here's why we got to do it. Here's what's going to happen if we don't. And here's what's going to happen if we do. But this is a life-threatening situation. And, we're going to have to do what we have to do to preserve the greatest good for the greatest number. So, and when you work alongside people, and they do see you working alongside them and working as hard as they are to preserve as much as you can. My experience has been that people will respond very well to that. Because usually you're going into a situation where the prior management has maybe tried to hide the ball. They haven't really told people what's going on. Like, people aren't stupid. They can see that things are going really, really poorly. So that has been my experience. Just kind of be honest with people, and be willing to listen, be willing to explain, and people are very good about taking bad news. Yeah.
I remember by the end of your stay there, the market share increased a bit from roughly like 14% to 16%. Was that right?
At Champion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of that was clearly you helped promote more efficient operations, and you also used your architect to kind of redesign some of the product. I'm wondering, is there anything else that you did that involved trying to make the product more distinctive so that it could be more competitive against the other companies that were in the same industry?
Yeah, actually the purchasing initiative in many cases involved like going to General Electric, who was providing all of the kitchen appliances. And what we would agree with people like GE is they were not eager to reduce the amount that we paid. So what they would agree to do is give us higher end appliances. So it turned out that while we may have been paying the same amount, we got a higher end appliance. So we made the homes more attractive in that respect. So there were several other vendors that we settled with on that basis. So we were effectively able to give the customers more. Although I think probably the biggest reason that our market share went up is another manufactured housing industry, Fleetwood, was in similar difficulty. They were like the number 3, and they didn't deal with it particularly well. So Fleetwood's market share went down. I think we captured from Fleetwood, captured a lot of what we got. But I do think we gave the customers more money. I'm not sure in that 6 months that all that many of those upgraded appliances had worked their way onto the dealer lot. I'd love to say, we figured out a way to do better, but it was probably mostly because of Fleetwood. Anybody? Yeah.
How did your experiences at Ernst and Young prepare you for restructuring?
Good question. How do my experiences at Ernst and Young prepare me for restructuring? Well, I think having a solid foundation in accounting and is really an essential part of understanding how a business operates and what is going to generate value and what is not going to generate value, what to worry about and what not to worry about. So by having a solid background in accounting, that then made it relatively easy for me to move over into the leverage deal market, where you're analyzing companies, whether to buy them and how much to pay for them. So I, on many occasions, have credited the solid foundation that I have in accounting because it's second nature to me, sort of what's going to generate cash, what's going to use cash, and what makes a good investment, not a good investment. So it is, I kind of marvel at, not everybody that I work with has that sort of background in accounting, and so I'm not saying that they can't be really, really capable without it. It just was very helpful for me. I think accounting, regardless of what you decide to do, you could be a salesperson, and understanding a balance sheet and understanding a cash flow statement will make you a better salesperson. Absolutely, no question about it. Yeah? Why did I leave accounting? I guess, I got to a point in my career where I'd been, with Ernst for 24 years, and honestly, I got a little bit bored. So I sort of had the opportunity to work in restructuring when I was with Ernst, when a company called LTV Steel went into bankruptcy, and I found that kind of fascinating. And then I had also an opportunity to move over into the leverage buyout business for a short while, and that, to me, it was just intriguing, and I, wanted to give something else a try. But I loved every minute of being with Ernst and all that, and worked with capable, great people. So it was not easy to leave. Yeah, David.
Al, taking you back a little bit further, were there things that you experienced or things that opportunities that you were presented with as an undergraduate that helped you launch you on your remarkable career?
Wow, I had an accounting professor, who has an accounting professorship named after a guy by the name of Ed Bidding, who was tremendous inspiration to me and a tremendous mentor. And so he, clearly had the biggest influence on me, as individually. But I had, a number of other, the class sizes were such that, you were never seated in a conference, in a classroom of 300 people. So I'd say the whole classroom experience was great, but, ed bidding was particularly wonderful.
You had some internships, I think, too, early on.
I did, yeah. I interned with Ernst in Philadelphia between my sophomore and junior year and I talked about it at dinner last night, but Ed Bidding encouraged me, said, well, why don't you go see if you can get, it was the Big 8 then, today it's the Big 4, why don't you go see if you can't get one of them to hire you this summer. So I went through the yellow pages and got all the addresses in Philadelphia and went knocking on doors and went to Ernst was, I think, the second one that I went to, and the managing partner agreed to see me, and I laid a sales pitch on him, and so he hired me for the summer, which was I was a proofreader, but it was still a great job. A proofreader, back in those days, reports were typed on typewriters, and they created a mat. From the mat was then put on a machine, and the reports were printed. Well, somebody had to make sure that there weren't typing mistakes, and so you sat there and one person read to another person who looked to see if there were mistakes. And then you had to so-called foot and crossfoot make sure all the numbers added up and that they hadn't made a mistake with the numbers. So it wasn't glamorous, and every morning at 9:30, one of my jobs was to go down to the coffee shop and bring up a big coffee order for everybody in the office. But it was still a job. I wore a suit every day, and I thought it was great. My second summer, they sent me out as an auditor, and then my senior year, we did, I think, like 6 weeks in the winter. So I was pretty well committed to Ernst before I ever graduated. I encourage any of you to try to do the same thing. Others? Looks not. Looks like we've exhausted. So thanks, everybody. It was great being here.